Hey folks, Dust here, and I kind of wanted to start doing a little bit more Valorant content on the channel, and I thought one way I could really provide some insight to the community is maybe sharing some of the history of some of the players in Valorant, as many of them have a Counter-Strike background, which happens to be an area that I'm very familiar with. If you don't know who I am because you're from the Valorant scene and you don't really follow Counter-Strike, which is fair enough, I have worked as a color commentator and desk analyst for many years for several different tournaments and leagues in CSGO. I've also in the past done play-by-play commentary. I've also done a lot of content on this YouTube channel that's Counter-Strike related. I've even written some articles for different websites focusing on, players and strategy and teams and results and all that good stuff. So if you want to check any of that out, if you're interested, feel free. But I just kind of wanted to test this out and see if there's something the Valorant community is interested in. If so, I can generate more of these videos. But where I wanted to start is essentially where North American Valorant started, which is T1, as they were the first organization to start picking up players. And so I kind of wanted to follow through each of these players when they were signed and just talk a little bit about them. Now, I know more about some than others, so I do apologize for that, as some of these people didn't have as much of a CS history as some of the others. And if I'm honest, this video is probably going to be quite long because I have a lot to cover here, especially with some of these players. Now, I will do some timestamps down below so that you can focus on the players that maybe you most care about if you feel the video is too long, or if you want to listen to the whole thing, do you. I'd really appreciate it. And if, of course, you like it, please follow, subscribe, like, and, post any comments that you have. And again, if it's something that people like, then maybe I'll generate some more videos, as I think I could easily talk about some of the other players and teams as well that are currently in the scene, as, again, Counter-Strike's kind of my forte, where I come from. And I'm interested, certainly, in Valorant, really because of its similarities to Counter-Strike as a game, but also because it has a lot of Counter-Strike players in the mix now. So it's pretty cool stuff. So again, we'll start with Swag, actually, because he was the first player signed in North America, essentially. He was signed to T1 on March 9th, so it's actually been quite some time ago they were signed to the team. And initially, I thought maybe it was just kind of like as a streamer, and I didn't really know how the competitive team formation would go because it was like so early on when he got signed. But we've obviously seen the scene develop, the Ignition series and all these different tournaments going on. And so really a team has formed around him, and he's actually seriously competing, which is really nice to see because, as you'll hear from Swag's story, he really, to me, kind of got robbed of having a professional esports career at way too young of an age, with really too harsh of a punishment for kind of a small crime when it's all said and done. But we'll get to that a little bit later. I want to get to some of his other history first. So you have to know that Swag is actually like this crazy phenom, because he essentially started competing professionally at 1.6 at a very, very young age with very little 1.6 experience heading into professional play. He was just 14 years old when he started competing in the biggest league in North America at the time, which is ESEA Invite, and he was already showing really great mechanical abilities and the potential to be a star player at his very first LAN, which is pretty much unheard of. Most players take some time to, develop that ability to transition online performance into LAN play, but he was able to do it pretty quickly. And I'm not saying that he was just doming everybody and absolutely just dropping monster statistics, but he did really well considering it was his first LAN, considering how young he was, considering how inexperienced he was. And he did quite well, and, it was just kind of awesome to see this kid come in and be playing with some of the veterans in the scene. He played alongside Nothing, Sean Garrett, some of these other guys in the NA scene at different points in time, Simphis as well. So just really cool to see this guy pop up kind of out of nowhere and be that next North American talent for Counter-Strike. And the other cool thing about Swag is he transitioned to CSGO very early. He was really one of the early adopters, and he put in so much time at the beginning, deathmatching, working on his mechanics, studying the game, and just trying to be the best possible CSGO player he could as soon as possible, because essentially he kind of missed the window on 1.6. I mean, 1.6 was, pretty much falling off towards 2011, 2012 as CSGO was coming out, and he didn't even start competing professionally at 1.6 until 2011. Again, it had been for a very long time at that point. So he jumped to CSGO very early, and he actually started out with Team Dynamic, who basically had a huge Counter-Strike source pedigree. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about AZK, because he was a big part of that Dynamic team in Counter-Strike Source. But anyway, he started out playing with some of the Dynamic players from Counter-Strike Source underneath the Dynamic banner. And the team was pretty good with it in North America, but didn't really do well internationally. And they were usually bested by some of the other better NA teams, like Area 51 and Quantic, etc., kind of going forward until Dynamic fizzled out and they all went their separate ways. And so where Swag really hit his mark in Counter-Strike was when he joined Complexity alongside Nothing, Sean Garrett, Hiko, and Simphis. And of course, Complexity has a very rich history in Counter-Strike. They were one of the big North American organizations next to EG, several other orgs throughout 1.6, and even a little bit of Counter-Strike Source with TGS and stuff like that. So it's a very historical name, a lot of prestige on that name, and even today they've really built themselves up with their partnership with the Dallas Cowboys, and they do have a Valorant team now as well, so people might be familiar with the organization from that. But he played with this team essentially from middle of 2013 until March of 2014. So he spent a very good chunk of his career on this team. He had a lot of big accomplishments with this team, including a top 4 at the very first CSGO major at DreamHack Winter 2013. And while he struggled a little bit individually, since it's his first time really playing at like a huge international LAN in CSGO, they still did manage to beat some really good teams like Very Games and Astana Dragons, who were certainly favored to beat Complexity. I think most people felt that way, but they were actually get some wins there. Again, get a top 4. I think they lost to the eventual champions, Fnatic, in the semifinal. So pretty cool little shout there. And then he started to pick up pace as a star player a little bit later on at some of the other ESEA lands, which again were mostly North American events, but eventually they turned into global finals where European teams did travel over. And his team took second place at the season 14 event. I believe that would have been maybe late 2013, early 2014 time period. And he also took a third place at the next season as well. So back-to-back top 3 finishes at ESEA events where they topped pretty much all the North American names, and they lost to NIP in the grand finals of season 14. And then season 15, they did lose to iBuyPower, which is kind of their rival North American team that had a little bit more skill and just seemed to play like a more sort of style and a little bit more confident style. And they had a really close series against Titans, which was essentially the former Very Games players, a really good French team, typically one of the top teams at this point in time. They didn't really have any big wins at this event, but they still placed pretty well. And then this team wound up kind of fizzling out after a top 8 finish at the EMS 1 Katowice major, where they lost to NIP in the quarterfinals in a 1-2 series. And then through all of this, first off, he was performing really, really well. It was very evident that this guy was a star of North America. Like him and Hiko are kind of like the biggest names that I think people were talking about kind of in this time period, and they were teammates on this Complexity lineup. And there were other players, don't get me wrong, like a lot of the iBuyPower guys had, really a lot of skill, but, Swag was really one of the names that was being talked about a lot because of his youth, for one, and the fact that he just seemed so versatile. I mean, he was really well known as like a lurker, more passive rifler and playing the edges of the map, and he was really well known for how he handled clutch situations, seemed to have a really good feel for how to handle the 1vx moments, as well as maybe he's with a teammate against 4, and just playing out through those scenarios. So really good at anchoring bomb sites, on the CT side and being able to play fantastic defense. And he also kind of fashioned himself to be a really good secondary opera on CT sides. When double op meta started to become a little bit more reasonable in the game, he was able to pick that up on his teams and really, again, just be able to lock down sites with the AWP. And don't get me wrong, on certain tactics and stuff, he could get into like trade fragging positions and kind of be a little bit more assertive, but he was always really more known as kind of playing by himself on the peripheries of the map, cutting off rotations, backstabbing, back when that traditional lurking style was really famous in CSGO and actually worked out pretty well. It wasn't until much later on that kind of got figured out and people kind of moved away from that style. So he was really like one of the big names in that style from the North American team, him and Hiko, and then obviously had Get Right on NIP that were kind of really known for that style of play. And so just absolutely started getting really, really consistent, putting up really good numbers and just playing super smart and just kind of a rock you could rely on to dig you out of tough situations in clutch moments or just locking down something. But he kind of made this surprising move to go over to the rival team iBuyPower. And maybe it wasn't too surprising in the sense that Complexity was losing to iBuyPower domestically, and it seemed like maybe they had the better chance to go on and continue to topple NA and then maybe eventually build something up to go to international events and place better. And so maybe I never really got the full story on this. I don't know if anyone really did. Maybe there's something out there in like an old interview that I can't remember, but he essentially decided to leave Complexity, which Complexity were kind of shocked by. And again, a lot of the community was too, because it just seemed like that core was quite good. I mean, it seemed like even though iBuyPower beat Complexity domestically, whenever Complexity would go internationally, they would do a little bit better, like on average. It wasn't always the case. But anyway, he joins his team in April 2014, and he plays with them until basically the end of the year and heading into early 2015. And his debut with this team was actually a first place finish at the next ESEA LAN, after the 2 that he played with Complexity, where they actually beat Complexity twice head-to-head, and they beat Virtus Pro to get the first place finish there. And then they also had some other really big accomplishments throughout the year, including a second place at the FACES Season 2 finals, where they beat LDLC, which is one of the top teams in the world, probably top 2 next to Fnatic, in an epic 2-0 series, particularly this Inferno game that went multiple overtimes. Even if you don't like Counter-Strike, if you want to see some really cool history of CS, I really recommend looking up this Season 2 finals of Face It, where they played LDLC in a best of 3. One of the most memorable series of that era of Counter-Strike, and for even now, it's still really relevant as one of the best 2-0s you'll probably ever see. Also, they beat the Danish team Dignitas, which was also quite good, and they fought really close against Fnatic. So this is like a really big event for them, a really big moment for North American Counter-Strike to see them place this well at a big international LAN event. They then went on to place top 8 ESWC that year, and they took third at the next ESEA LAN. And it just seemed like this team was on the cusp of doing a lot of great things going forward. So, right, at this point, there was supposed to be a super team forming. for iBuyPower, where they were going to keep Swag and AZK. They were going to bring back Daze, who they had actually removed at one point. They were going to bring him back as the in-game leader. You were going to have Swag and AZK. You were going to have Skadoodle as your opper, and I believe Hiko was supposed to be the other rifle on his team. And this was supposed to be like this NA super team, basically, that everyone was seeing form. And there was even talk that this team was going to get picked up by Evil Geniuses, which would have been huge, because at that point, EG wasn't in CSGO yet, but they had a huge brand recognition from being, you know, a very popular team in CS 1.6. And it looked like we were going to get this just monster team for 2015 for NA that could really do some big things. But then, if you're not aware, there was the whole match-fixing bang scandal, where basically the team threw a kind of meaningless TiVo match, which is like another league in NA that was kind of seen as inferior to ESEA, though they did offer up pretty good prize money, and they had a lot of the top teams playing, so I mean, it was still a pretty good league for NA to go alongside ESEA. But anyway, they threw kind of this meaningless game for skins, because there was CSGO Lounge where you could bet skins on matches, and apparently they had gotten people to bet skins for them, and then they were going to get the skins after the game was over, cash them out, make a little bit of money, because back then salaries weren't really meaningful in CSGO, in the sense that they were just quite small, and the scene really hadn't developed yet. And anyway, Swag went along with this, even though he was quite young. I think he was maybe 18 or so at the time whenever this whole situation happened. Obviously, AZK and Skadoodle were on this team when this whole situation happened, but Skadoodle didn't take any skins, so he wound up not getting banned, but everyone else did on the team, which, you know, includes Steel, Dazed, AZK, Swag, and a few others that don't really mean much in this story. But anyway, that basically ended the guy's CS career, for the most part. I mean, he did try to make a return a little bit later on, where he stood in for Cloud9 a few times that year for like small tournaments who didn't really care about the bans, because it was at first really just like a Valve ban for CSGO majors, but then many of the leagues and tournaments, kind of like DreamHack, ESL, etc., eventually followed suit and also issued, you know, basically bans that didn't have any set limits. And so he would kind of hop in like these really small events like CS Summits and these other things for Cloud9 as kind of just a stand-in, and Cloud9 kind of picked him up to be kind of a content creator, streamer type person, and have him under contract. In this case that they ever got the bans lifted, they would have this guy ready to go on the team, I think was another kind of probably a big part of that, but it never really happened. And so he just only periodically stood in for games for 2015, 2016. And it wasn't really until like maybe 2018, maybe late 2017, that leagues and tournaments actually started lifting bans, like ESL, the DreamHack circuit, you know, different things happening. And nowadays, pretty much they can compete anything other than CSGO majors, but a lot of big teams don't want them for that reason, because they want to do well at majors and make majors, and they have to use stand-ins and stuff like that. So it's really caused a lot of limitations for these players. And so Swag never really got to go big in CSGO until like 2018, 2019 time period, and he just never really hit the same levels. I mean, he played on a few different teams. Probably the most notable as far as recently would have been like Soul Patrol and Lazarus last year, and they played like a Mountain Dew League, eventually made the ESL Pro League, but they never really accomplished much, and it just felt like kind of a weird like comeback story for Swag, where it just didn't really feel like a full comeback in the sense, because he never really got any of the big teams. He didn't seem to be in the same shape. And I mean, the thing is, the game was not accessible to him at a professional level for 2 to 3 years, really. So I mean, you can imagine all that time off, you know, losing motivation, building up a little bit of rust, all those different things. It seemed like he never really got to fulfill that moment where you got to make a true comeback story and kind of rise back to his old level, because again, he was one of the best players in North America. At times you could have probably called him the best, considering how young he was and how versatile he was, and that was all basically stripped away from them. And don't get me wrong, he committed a thing that was against the rules. He deserved to be punished for it, but most of the community, it's pretty much a consensus that the punishment was definitely way too steep to basically permanently ban the guy from majors, as still to this day these players cannot play majors despite the fact that this situation happened 5 years ago, essentially. It's really, really depressing, actually. So yeah, it's kind of neat to see Swag now in Valorant, because I think this gives him a true chance to basically restart his esports career as a professional player, and he's only 23 years old even to this day, so he still has a lot of years ahead of him if he so chooses, and I really hope that he can make something happen in this game, because I really feel like he was robbed of having a career in CSGO due to just draconian punishment for a crime that, in the grand scheme of things, was not worthy of being basically permanently banned from being able to play at the top level of CSGO consistently. So hopefully Valorant will be a chance for him to write a new chapter of his career and continue that on. Now we'll talk about AZK, who for through those iBuyPower days was actually a teammate of Swag. He was signed to T1 Valorant in April, so not too long after Swag, pretty quickly after that. Now, he has a huge Counter-Strike Source pedigree, on Team Dynamic, that team that I had briefly mentioned when I was talking about Swag. This team was essentially at the top of North American Counter-Strike Source from 2009 to 2012, and they were essentially always a top 2 team in North America, and at several different ESEA lands and LAN champs and different events that were going on in NA. And from that 3-year stretch, they won 5 ESEA lands in a row, and they won 7 out of 8 of the ESEA lands they played in during that 3-year stretch. The only time that they didn't take first was when they lost to Steel's Fully Torqued team, which you might know Steel. He plays on Chaos and Counter-Strike Go right now, and sometimes streams Valorant and stuff like that. Maybe might have interest in playing it in the future. Some of the other players on this team you probably wouldn't know if you're not like a really big Counter-Strike fan. Those people like Frost, TCK, Ryan from Zomblers, different things like that. They also had some good international results, though they didn't play internationally very often because there wasn't really any salaries in Counter-Strike Source. So basically, if you were going to travel to a European event, it was basically out of your pocket. So it didn't really happen very often, but they did place second at an event called DS Rack. And they took 4th at ESWC 2011, and so they were definitely really up there the few times they could go international play. And basically in Counter-Strike Source, AZK was a really, really good opper. Counter-Strike Source, it was pretty popular to do a 2-op meta, particularly on CT sides, but you can even pull it off on T sides because the way the economy system worked in that game is a bit different than CSGO, so it's easier to pull off. And basically it was like AZK and Adren, who Adren was the former head coach of Team Liquid, now currently dropped from that team just as Nitro did before he joined 100 Thieves as a Valorant player. And so they were like this duo of oppers that were basically topping the charts in North America for several years in that category. Then he moves over to CSGO very early on with Dynamic. In fact, the first CSGO LAN that AZK played, he essentially played the Counter-Strike Source LAN first, and Swag actually played the 1.6 LAN that event, and then they wound up flipping and playing a CSGO event basically the next day or something like that. So it was kind of this funny transition period. And he was on Team Dynamic. Again, he was initially alongside Swag. Swag may have left the team before AZK did. And then Dynamic, a lot of those players kind of broke off, and then he essentially joined Curse, which was basically the precursor to iBuyPower. I mean, Curse included a player like Skadoodle, who would later be on iBuyPower later, and players like Adren and Anger, who I think now plays Valorant as well. Now, I think he actually just recently got picked up, if I'm not mistaken. Indeed, I believe it was like Rise or Rise Nation or something along those lines. So maybe you recognize Anger a little bit there as well. So a couple of different players ran through this team. I'm not really going to go through them all because, again, it's like really nitty-gritty CSGO history at that point. But essentially, they placed well at a couple of ESEA events, stuff like that. But then eventually he joined up on iBuyPower alongside Swag, Daze, a couple other players from the scene. And he was, again, on that same team with Swag that did really well at the ESEA LAN events, did well at the Katowice event, as well as having the Face of Stage 2 event. That basically all the stuff that I talked about with Swag, AZK was alongside of all that. And essentially, him as a player, he was like sneakily always getting really good numbers. Like, he was never the super flashy one that would necessarily make your jaw drop or something that you like noticed a lot, but he would just quietly get his numbers and, you know, get 20 plus kills a game. And he was kind of that glue player where he kind of facilitated everyone else and kind of had everything together. He could definitely play aggressive rifling roles. He didn't really op in CSGO except for very early on because, again, opping was only something that really one player did on a team instead of two, like Source. Again, sometimes with TT sides you would do it, but it wasn't really prevalent. Even to this day, it's not super prevalent, except for CT sides on certain maps. So, yeah, he kind of phased out of that role that he had from Source and kind of phased more into being, I wouldn't call him a support rifler necessarily, because it's not like he ever played like the lurk roles or positions you would classically call a support position. He would, again, sometimes play like the entry fragger, the second guy in, to kind of help trade frag your way into sites. But at times he could also hold solo positions and things. He was very flexible in what he could do. And again, it seemed like he kind of made room for other players like Skadoodle, like Swag, some of these star players that he played alongside. He kind of really helped, again, kind of fill the gaps and mesh some of that. And definitely very, very consistent, very good team player, very good communicator. Definitely just a really well-rounded player, kind of a utility player almost, I guess you could say, in the different slots he could fill. And yeah, he was banned alongside Swag in the whole match fixing scandal, which basically ended his CSGO career. He did make a brief return on Torqued and GX alongside Swag very briefly, but that team kind of fizzled out, didn't do much except for make like one DreamHack Open event and maybe some other online stuff, but didn't really do anything in the LAN environment. And then obviously, if you follow Overwatch, AZK was on Team Liquid in early 2016 to mid 2017. They did okay in a couple of North American tournaments before Overwatch really started to grow and move towards the OWL direction. But he didn't stick around long enough to really try to be a professional in that game. I think he also dabbled in Quake Champions, but I think that was maybe mostly for show matches where he played for Team Liquid in a couple of, like, one of the game modes that they had that wasn't dual. I can't remember what it was called. And he's also kind of been known as a guy who could kind of jump from game to game and still be very skilled. Just kind of his brain works that way, where he can kind of get into a game and get pretty good at it very quickly. So that's just a little bit of history about AZK to go along with Swag. Now, next player to join T1 Valorant was crashies, and I'm afraid that I don't really have nearly as much information about this player. He's basically the youngest player on the team, I think, at 22 years old. I'm not sure if Food might be a little bit younger than him. I don't know Food's age. But he has a pretty small CSGO background. He didn't really start competing with any official results that I could find until probably about early 2017, so a much later start than people like AZK and Swag, who basically been playing it since the beginning in 2012. Basically came 5 years after those guys did. And anyway, he played in Mountain Dew League, is kind of where he mostly played for teams like Monstars and Bad News Bears and Riot Squad, so that might be some names you're familiar with if you followed like the semi-pro scene of North American Counter-Strike. He usually performed really well in Mountain Dew League and online within the North American region, and seemed like a player to keep an eye on. It was really too early to call. I think right when he was kind of forming up is when he made a jump to Valorant here the last year or so. So really hard to know how good he would have been in Counter-Strike if he had stuck around. And again, he didn't have a very rich CS history. I think maybe the thing you might know him from recently, if you follow CSGO, is that he played on the team that essentially represented Fun Plus Phoenix in the first season of Flashpoint. This is essentially the old Bad News Bears roster, and it was like a really weird situation where they weren't truly like part of Fun Plus Phoenix, but Fun Plus Phoenix owned a slot in the league, and it was like this really weird situation where this Danish team was supposed to join Fun Plus Phoenix, but then they wound up not because their old org Heroic didn't sell them, and it was like a really weird situation I don't want to get into. But anyway, they played it for this Fun Plus Phoenix roster or org sort of for Flashpoint. And he played alongside players who now play Valorant, like Mitch and Dapper, which Dapper being over in Sentinels, Mitch being over at Cloud9. And so he played alongside those guys there, but they didn't really do well in this league, and that was kind of his parting, from CSGO, was after this whole Flashpoint season was over. Maybe he played a little bit of online stuff after that, but nothing really notable, nothing that was consistent. And so, yeah, I don't really know a whole lot about Cratchy's career, to be honest, but just know that he did have a start in CSGO for a few years, playing mostly at a semi-pro level in the Mountain Dew League, which is just below the ESL Pro League, and played some online stuff at fairly top level, I guess you could say, within the North American region. Didn't really do anything internationally, and again, never really got to a consistent pro level in the sense of competing in the pro leagues regularly, being at LAN events in the open circuit. That never really happened for crashies. Again, it was, maybe it could have been because he did show some promise, but he jumped over to Valorant. I think some people kind of noticed his talent from CSGO, perhaps, and made him an offer that was better than maybe what he was wanting to do. Maybe he just wanted something different. I don't know. Maybe because he didn't have a huge CS background, he was a little bit more open to transitioning to a different game and starting a different type of career. So that's kind of to give you a little bit on crashies. Now, for Food, I do know a little bit more about this player. I've actually watched him play quite a bit in some of the ESL Pro League and even some smaller stuff like WESG. So I do know a little bit more about him. And essentially, he started making a name for himself in Mountain Dew League kind of in 2018, towards the middle or end of the year. I mean, he played before that on, other teams, but this is when you kind of noticed him being a pretty good player. And it seemed like his really big break was when he played with Gorilla Gang, otherwise known as Singularity, for a time in late 2018, where they took a third place in Mountain Dew League, and he looked quite impressive individually throughout this time. Kind of an aggressive, snappy rifler, could play solo roles, but he was always really aggressive, and certainly a lot of his teams played a faster paced style, where he was just kind of one of those guys with a mixed trade fragging. But there were other points in his career where he would take maybe more of a kind of a lurk role or play solo in default kind of thing. So he kind of had a role swap at one point in his career, but I remember him being a very assertive, aggressive player, a very confident player when he was playing in Mountain Dew League at this time. And then they just missed out in the ESL Pro League in relegation, but they won WSG USA over some of the other MDL teams like Soul Patrol and Space Station, so they had an international event that they were going to go to. And he played with players like Osi, who's now on Cloud9 for Counter-Strike. He also played with Vanity, who's now on Chaos. He played with Ryan, who was for a time on Envy in CSGO, and a couple other players you might recognize. But really, I guess his big team as far as playing at a pro level is when he eventually joined E United alongside Vanity from the Singularity project, and then other guys like Cooper and Freakazoid and Marky who came over from Swole Patrol. Moose was also involved over E United for a time as well. And this team did play in the ESL Pro League, the Pro League for North America, for Season 9 and Season 10, and they also played in DreamHack Open Rio in early 2019. They also played in IM Sydney and ESL 1 New York. So they actually were able to qualify for some LAN events within the region, a little bit more than what Crashies was doing on some of his teams. So they did take that next step. At least they competed in the pro leagues and they qualified for the LAN events. They didn't really do much at these events. They didn't really place deeply in EPL, make the LAN finals or anything like that. They didn't really do well at Sydney or ESL 1 New York. And Food, as a player, seemed to kind of plateau, maybe even at times kind of dip a little bit in form. It was surprising because he showed so much promise in the Mountain Dew League level in 2018, but when it got into 2019, it just seemed like something happened. Maybe he just didn't really transition well into the pro level. Maybe he needed more time. Maybe he needed more experience. Maybe he was not in the right environment. Maybe when he had to change up roles a little bit a couple of times, maybe it kind of messed him up. I'm not really sure. Maybe he lost motivation. I can't really know these things. I can only go off of the results that I saw and what I saw from watching him play. So I don't mean to make any assumptions or, throw the guy under the bus or anything like that. It's just true that the team kind of plateaued, didn't get any big results, and then he kind of just didn't seem like he kept growing as a player in CSGO the way that people would have expected considering how well he played the Mountain Dew League level. He also did play some Counter-Strike early this year in 2020 with XE United and Soul Patrol and a couple other teams, but they didn't qualify for Flashpoint or any of the DreamHack Open events they tried to make too, and they also missed out on a couple other things. Had some really mixed results in EPL Season 11 where they got some upsets against teams like 100 Thieves and Team Liquid and Furia, but then lost to some weaker teams like Made in Brazil. And they obviously lost to EG, who's been like a powerhouse online NA, kind of usurping Team Liquid's the number one team in North America right now, at least for now. And they play sixth in this pro league for the North American region, which was split in online now because of COVID, obviously. But then he stepped away from Counter-Strike in basically April and May of this year, and then obviously in May is when he joined this T1 team. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see whether or not he thrives in Valorant long term. Certainly he's had some good events so far. Seems like he's, looking pretty good. So hopefully this continues, as I think that Fu was a guy that definitely showed some potential in CSGO at times, but then it just seemed like something kind of happened last year, and I'm not really sure what it was, if he could have dug himself out of it, if he didn't get the right role or wasn't on the right team. But he's moved over to Valorant now, certainly has a lot of mechanical abilities. That was one of the things that you could always tell from watching him, like his aim, his movement was always quite good. Maybe it was just some of the lacking of experience with decision-making and the strategy and the finer tactics and things of that nature. Not really sure, but maybe with Valorant, it's kind of a fresh thing. Everyone's learning it, and maybe that will give him the start that he needs to, really have a good history in Valorant going forward. Now, last but not least, we're going to talk about Skadoodle, who, like AZK and Swag, has a very, very rich history in CSGO, and in fact, probably has the biggest accomplishments of any of them, simply because he wasn't banned. He was on the same team as those guys that got banned, but he was the one player that did not receive any skins or any money after the match-fixing situation, so he was able to continue on his career. And prior to that, he had a very early start in the game, just like AZK and Swag. So he came over from CSGO from AVA, which is essentially a free first-person shooter, kind of like Crossfire or Combat Arms, that's very, very popular in Korea. And he was on the North American team that represented USA in Korea, and they actually won an event over in Korea. I believe it was either in 2010 or 2011, like the IESF or something like that, where they actually beat one of the Korean teams in the finals, actually won the event. And one of the players that you would recognize from that was Michael 3D, who came over to CSGO with Skadoodle, and they basically formed up what was called Hold Mouse 1, but eventually got picked up by Curse. And basically what happened was ESEA, the main league in North America, when CSGO came out, they were trying to use this to kind of unite the communities of 1.6 and CS Source, and also bring over players from other FPSs. So there was a couple of 1.6 and top Source teams invited, and some players who formed teams that were top in CS 1.6 and Source for ESEA in previous seasons. And then they invited this one team that was basically a mix of players from other FPS titles. So you had Michael 3D and Skadoodle coming over from this AVA team that I think they're called DEF CON or something like that. And I don't know if anybody else on this Curse lineup was also from DEF CON, but that's the only two names that I saw. Then you had Emong, who now is actually quite famous as a streamer for Overwatch, even I think sponsored by one of the organizations in Overwatch. I don't really follow Overwatch much, so I can't say more than that. I think Michael 3D also kind of moved over to Overwatch and did some streaming, but not nearly as big of a name as Emong. And I think Emong actually came from like Brink or some other like FPS titles and stuff like that, if I'm not mistaken. Then there was also TM, or the man, who was on this team. And then Juvenile, who I want to say he was a COD 4 Pro mod player in North America. He was a pretty good one as well. Though I don't think like the North American teams were ever really big internationally in COD 4, because COD 4 was pretty popular basically around the same time that Counter-Strike Source was. It's one of the last CODs to be really competitive on PC before there was a huge shift to, of course, the Xbox and eventually PlayStation for what you see now in CWL. So I really Juvenile came from that team also. And later he played alongside players like Frost and Anger in the early Curse days, and then eventually when people like Adren, Dazed, AZK, stuff started coming over, he was a part of those teams as well. And here's the thing, he was very quickly regarded as one of the best operators in North America, pretty much right off the bat of CSGO in 2013. His team was a top 3 team within North America. They did really well within the ESEA seasons and online tournaments, but they really just didn't do anything at all when they went to like DreamHack and Copenhagen Games and stuff early on. And the team didn't really go anywhere. And there was a lot of change to this team. Again, bringing in guys like Adren, Dazed, AZK, other players, eventually Swag, before they formed into iBuyPower and this team really got off the ground. And again, he was a part of that iBuyPower team that won those ESC events I talked about earlier with Swag and AZK and the Face It Season 2 and stuff like that. And this is when he became a true star, was during that period in 2014 when they were winning these ESCA events and they were doing well at Face It Season 2 against LDLC and Fnatic. He was just no doubt the best opera in North America at this point, and he was even having international success and looking like one of the top 5 operas in the world. Just absolutely fantastic stuff from this guy. Really showing you something. Just follows a similar story to Swag, essentially, at this point, up until the ban that happens in early 2015. Now, at that point, he was supposed to be a part of the super team that included Hiko, Daze, AZK, and Swag. But when that all fell apart, initially Hiko and Skadoodle were going to stick together, which, of course, you'll know Hiko because now he plays on 100 Thieves. In fact, he's like the only player left on 100 Thieves after they cut pretty much everybody, and then they brought in Nitro, and we're still waiting to see what the rest of that roster is going to be at the time of me recording this. Anyway, after that side tangent, we'll get back to it now. He eventually split up from Hiko, and he joins Cloud9 alongside Freakazoid, Sean Gares, Shroud, and Nothing. Of course, Shroud now a very famous streamer. Nothing now basically retired from professional play and does a lot of streaming and content and sponsor stuff and things of that nature. Definitely a really big ambassador in the scene. Then Freakazoid, I believe, is still sticking with Counter-Strike. I think he dabbled in Valorant, but kind of went back to CS. And then Sean Garrett obviously does the Immortal Minds podcast for Valorant that you might watch if you're in Valorant. He also did just commentate with DDK for the FaZe Invitational. A very well-known in-game leader. Eventually became a desk analyst, stuff like that as well in the North American scene. So you definitely know Sean Garrett. And this is where they had the very famous and sometimes memed summer 2015 run of second-place finishes, where they became, at that point, one of the most accomplished North American CS teams in international events ever, because they actually did it consistently. They won for 3 events back to back. They came second place and were battling against the best teams in the world and doing very well. This was EPL Season 1, ESWC 2015, and the Face It Stage 2 finals when they kind of shifted their branding a little bit with how their league was named. And they beat several top teams. They beat Envy several times. They challenged Fnatic and Na'Vi close, and in the case of one event, they actually beat Fnatic and Na'Vi and upset them. That was at Face It, I believe it was Face It Stage 2 when they got second place there. So this was actually a really impressive run, and Skadoodle, again, establishing himself as one of the best hoppers in the world at this point. Definitely top 5 at this period if he wasn't already, in that 2014 stretch with the iBuyPower team. So this was really, really cool stuff. Now, their team really did start to struggle, like going later into 2015, but still doing well within North America. But then they picked up some steam after some roster changes back in mid to late 2016, culminating in the EPL Season 4 championship in Brazil over SK Gaming, the Brazilian team that was like winning majors and placing top 4 consistently. This team slips in on Brazilian soil and beats SK, as well as Mouse Sports and some other pretty good teams, including Optic, who was a pretty hot team at the end of 2016 internationally. They had done really well at like E-League and some other stuff, so they were certainly considered a very good team. They were able to beat them there as well. And so that brief moment for a couple of months there in 2016, this team kind of picked back up some steam, and Skadoodle picked back up some steam as well as a player. But then they struggled again for quite some time, until they found some consistency basically in late 2017 and into early 2018, where they had some big finishes at events like DreamHack Montreal, E-League Premier, DreamHack Open Denver, iBuyPower Masters, IM Oakland, basically a few different events that was like in the mid to late portion of 2017. And they were basically beating all the top teams in the world except for Astralis and FaZe, particularly FaZe. FaZe would batter the shit out of this team. Like, it wasn't even close when they played against FaZe. FaZe just had all these superstar players that were super, super skilled. They had Kerrigan, who was a pretty crafty in-game leader, using really skilled players, playing a looser system. And FaZe would absolutely just batter the shit out of this team. It wasn't even close. It was bad. It was real bad. Don't go watch those games if you're an NACS fan. Like, they were rough. Anyway, the point is, though, is that they had that miracle run in E-League Boston just afterwards to kick off 2018, which was the biggest accomplishment for North American Counter-Strike at the time. It was definitely the only time, still to this day, that an NA team won a CSGO major. Obviously, Team Liquid's, run of success in 2019, the IM Grand Slam is considered the best accomplishment NA team's ever had, which Nitro, who's now in 100 Thieves, was a big part of that, of course. And if you follow Counter-Strike, you'll know the other Liquid players. But yeah, at this point in time, this was the biggest single tournament result any NA team had ever accomplished, winning the major. And the crazier story was that they were on the brink of being eliminated early after losses and some best of ones in the group stage. They were one best of one away from being eliminated. And then they actually ran it all the way back, won some best of ones against VP Astralis and Vega Squadron, made the playoffs, crushed G2 in the quarterfinals, had a pretty decisive 2-1 victory over SK, again, the team that they beat EPL Season 4 the year before. And they then had this crazy best of three against FaZe. Again, a team that would absolutely batter them, but basically not even allow them double digits in a lot of the games they played against. They actually came and they beat FaZe in this really super heated grand final where they lost the first map, really close, 14-16. But then they won map 2, and then they won the third map in double overtime on Inferno. Again, one of the craziest games you could probably watch in CSGO history. Then the crazy thing about this was is that Skadoodle, like being such a quiet player, never really did interviews, did much content, did anything on talk shows or podcasts or like that, very much in the background as far as like a brand and a personality, has this really emotional interview on stage and winds up being the MVP of this tournament. And just, it was just like a beautiful moment for Skadoodle, essentially. And this is because the thing is, what Skadoodle is like early on, he was a star opper that was the focus of many teams. Teams were kind of built around him, especially that first team, Curse. And then even on Out by Power, he was very much one of the star players on the team next to Swag and stuff like that. Just was definitely one of the key players on the team that could have a lot of impact. But I feel like on Cloud9, after the 2015 summer run, when they started making a lot of roster changes, he kind of went to the background. He was like more of a support opper almost in this weird way where he would like hold angles and do like safe things to kind of facilitate the other players to be more assertive and aggressive. Guys like Stewie 2K, Tarek, Rush, some of the other guys, Automatic, that would come into the team and like kind of be some stars. Like there were so many stars, not enough role players, where Skadoodle almost kind of became a role player. He would, again, on T sides, just hold angles, let the other players kind of push forward, and so he wasn't really having crazy impact or going for really big plays. He could still lock things down on the CT side, and one of the crazy things about Skadoodle was that he was super clutch. Like even though he was an opper, not a rifler, because most of the time people that get left in clutches are more riflers, because usually oppers are like going for opening picks or things of that nature. He would tend to be like that mid to late round player and was really, really successful. He was mega smart in those situations. One of the smartest players I've ever seen in CSGO from NA that could just handle clutch moments so very well. Just always seemed to make the best decision every single time to give him the best chance to win a round. Or even if like the team was really far behind, he would still do all the smartest things he could do to at least give themselves a chance to win. And many times he would pull off these crazy things in clutch moments. Even when he started slumping individually and his numbers would go down, he was still always really gold in those types of moments. And so this whole E-League Boston thing in 2018 was great because he definitely had his slumps in 2017. Definitely appeared to just not be the same player that he had been pretty much every year prior. I mean, from 2013 through 2015, I mean, this guy was just always touted as one of the best, but it just seemed like in 2017 and even moments 2016, it just seemed to kind of fall off a bit. Then he has this big moment in Boston, but unfortunately, Cloud9 essentially falls apart after this. Like, Tarek and Stewie go to Made in Brazil for a time before going their separate ways, where Tarek's now an Evil Geniuses and Stewie's, of course, over at Team Liquid. And they just had crazy roster moves all the time. It was basically a fucking revolving door. Just total mismanagement of the team throughout basically early 2018 through very recently, where they finally like picked up like a team of a bunch of young upcoming players that came from Mountain Dew League, essentially. So yeah, it was just a really bad environment, and Skadoodle just seemed to fall to shambles when this team kind of started caving and just having this revolving roster. And even he was cut from the team and then brought back in kind of this awkward situation. And so it kind of almost hurt his legacy a bit, I guess, towards the end of CSGO. But he will still always go down as, for several years, the best opera in North America and one of the best operas in the world. And at a time, this dude was a true star. Again, I know that his last year or so of play certainly kind of went downhill. And again, he had his slumps throughout his career. But when he was on point, motivated, in the right environment, the guy could thrive. And just some of the stuff he could do was incredible. And then he went on to be a really big, successful streamer for a time. And that's why I was actually so surprised to see him join this team and try to be competitive in an FPS again in esports. I'll see how it goes going forward. But yeah, it's kind of nuts to see Sky actually make a return. Now, again, I do apologize for the video being so long, but timestamps will be down below. And again, if you enjoy this content, you want to see me do more videos like this, please follow, subscribe, let me know. Throw a comment. Follow me on social media. Let me know if this is the kind of content you like to see. I definitely could crank out some more videos if you're interested in the history of these players. This is kind of my, I don't know, like putting my foot in the water a little bit into Valorant. Kind of supplying insight that I know I can for now to see if you folks enjoy. Then maybe down the road I'll do even different types of content for Valorant. Maybe even get involved as a commentator or desk analyst or something in the future. Certainly interested. But I figured this would be kind of my way to put a foot in the door, which will help me a little bit, but also helps the community a bit if they're interested in learning about some of these players if they didn't follow Counter-Strike. So hope you enjoyed it again. Catch you next time.